Looking back at this, at Mises being the originator of this, of the knowledge that socialism is impossible and can't work, I think we should look back at Mises' life and what happened, and the events in Austrian economics to gauge the future. We have to look at what's been happening in the recent immediate past. As I said, after collectivism was being established and socialism was being established in the world, in Europe, Mises wrote this article. In addition to that, he was discriminated against. He couldn't get a university post in Austria, a paid university post. He got an unpaid post, prestigious but unpaid, which meant, of course, he had to find work elsewhere, largely because he was opposed to socialism and collectivism. And there were only two kinds of economists or social scientists who received paid university posts in Austria at the time. Either Marxists or fascists or corporatists. That's it. They were the only respectable. That was the wave of the future. And the laissez-faire was reactionary, Neanderthal, and part of the 19th century, which was being displaced by the great progressive new century, the 20th century. So in addition to that, the second thing which disqualified Mises from a paid university post was he was uncompromising. He was a great guy. I mean, he's sometimes been accused of being personally abrasive. I never saw it. Those of us who studied under him in the United States. He was unbelievably sweet. He was constantly urging people, finding research projects for people to do, which he usually didn't do, of course, but always coming up with ideas and always being unfailingly courteous and unfailingly and non-bitter about what had happened to him. And so here he was, but he refused to compromise one iota. In other words, he didn't bend with the wind, with intellectual winds, which all too often happens in the world, as we all know. He didn't say, well, let's try to work within the system and say statism is okay, but you should have a little bit of tinkering here and there, like a little currency reform or a little wage reform or something like that. He was absolutely uncompromising and kept developing his ideas and his great works. And in the meantime, not having a paid university post, he had a full-time post as chief economist for the Chamber of Commerce, which in Austria was a government agency where businessmen elected representatives to this chamber, and they would have a staff and they would advise the government. As a result, Mises became the major economic advisor, although his advice wasn't listened to very much. He was tremendously respected. So he almost single-handed, he and a couple of friends of his, essentially single-handedly stopped the Austrian inflation, which was rampant, as well as the German after World War I, stopped it from a runaway inflation. He stopped it at what, 1,200% or whatever, instead of becoming as in Germany, 1 quadrillion marks to the dollar. There was only 1,200 Austrian shillings or whatever, pfennigs, whatever the currency unit was to the dollar. Later in his memoirs, which was written in the midst of his flight from Europe in 1940, he said now looking back on it, he wishes that he hadn't fought it because it was hopeless in the long run anyway, because it just lengthened the time of the inflation, just slowed it down, and the result was the banking crash and collapse in 1931. But as a matter of fact, one of the very sweetest things, one of the most charming and moving passages in this book, he said he's always been accused of being too uncompromising. If only had waffled, he might have been more influential. And looking back on it, he said, no, I wasn't hardcore enough. I wasn't uncompromising enough. Looking back on it, I should have been tougher.